All right. Thank you, everybody, for watching that with us. I wanted to take the time to introduce our panelists before we take some question and answer opportunity. So first, I would like to introduce Ellie. Thank you so much for being here. This was my first, well, actually my second time because I previewed the film, but second time watching, and I just am so moved by this film. Eliyahu Ungar-Sargon is an award-winning independent filmmaker who has been writing, talking about, and making long and short-form video content on the subject of infant circumcision for 2 decades. He grew up in Israel, and after 3 years in medical school, he decided to become a filmmaker. After achieving 2 degrees from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Ellie made his first feature-length documentary film, Cut, on the subject of circumcision and Jewish identity. In 2021, Ellie co-founded Bruhim, which is a nonprofit advocacy organization for Jewish families who have decided not to circumcise their boys. Ellie lives in Los Angeles with his wife and fellow troublemaker, Penny. So again, thank you so much, Ellie, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'd also like to introduce Ron, who was in the film. So Ron Low's degrees are in engineering and entrepreneurship. In 2023, he and his wife, Alice, founded TLC Tugger Foreskin Restoration Devices, ultimately helping over 60...
I'm sorry, I meant to say 2003. If I typed 2023, that was a mistake.
Oh. Did I set, that was my mistake. I apologize. I thought that was way too recent. My apologies. I just read it wrong. Thank you for speaking up. So in 2003, much longer. In 2003, he and his wife, Alice, founded TLC Tugger Foreskin Restoration Devices, ultimately helping over 65,000 men before retiring and selling the business 2 decades later. We're not in 2043, so. He has advocated for intactivism from coast to coast in dozens of Pride events, in 7 documentaries, on the Howard Stern Show, on the Learning Channel, on the BBC, and on HBO, and on karaoke stages, big and small. These days, he's developing a one-man musical called The Foreskin Diaries, which he'll debut at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival next August. And he's preparing to launch a podcast celebrating intactivists called Foreskin for the Win. We also have with us Dan Strandjord, who was also in the documentary. Thanks, Dan, for being here. Circumcision has been an issue for Dan Strandjord ever since he can remember, and no one would ever tell him the truth about what happened to him. After finding out the truth, he decided to talk about it to anyone who would listen. He is most famous for protesting almost every weekday for 10 years outside the University of Chicago Hospital. So, at this time, if any of the attendees have questions, just a reminder that you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom. If you wouldn't mind putting your comments in there, that would be great. And I'll try to facilitate and read the questions out loud and direct them to the appropriate person. While we give people an opportunity to do that, Ellie, do you have any words you want to share, or any of the other panelists?
I'm very grateful to you for having me here. It's been a while since I've seen the film. It brings back memories, and Ron and Dan and I all look very young compared to what we look like right now, which also made me smile a little bit.
My hair was white back then also.
That is true.
I had dark hair, but this chair hasn't changed color. I noticed it's the same chair you sat me in for the interview.
It totally is. I noticed that too.
Oh, that's funny. Oh, Tim, you're muted.
There we go. I just have a comment, Ellie. I will have a question later, but for now, I was impressed about the movement that your father seemed to have made in his thinking on this issue. Do you have any thoughts or comments you want to share about that process of where he was versus where he is, well, where he was at the time the film debuted versus where he is today in 2024?
Sure. I think my conversations with my father are kind of like the emotional core of Cut. And there were three conversations that I had with him over the course of about 18 months, and I strategically placed parts of them in a kind of arc in the film. Um, and it's pretty, I mean, it's not literally the order in which the chronological order in which his thinking developed, but it's more or less emotionally exactly what happened over those 18 months. So we had a kind of progression in our conversation from like anger to a kind of grudging acceptance to love. And that was kind of that was a real trajectory that happened in the course of our conversations. Now, my relationship with my father has always been one of kind of deep intellectual engagement and debate. So that part of it, like sometimes it might feel a little more tense than it actually was. We just sometimes we debate that way. But there was a real kind of shift over time, and I know that after the film was over, he participated in the promotion of the film and some of the subsequent tour stops. We did some panels together. We did a Limud session together. And I know that it changed the way he thought about circumcision. He told me that for the first time, he was really thinking about it from the infant's perspective. And I don't know that I'd say he's come around to my way of thinking about this. I think that would not be accurate. I think he's come to appreciate my perspective, and he's still a very sort of deeply religious and spiritual person, and very much embedded in the Orthodox Jewish community in Chicago. And but like given all of that, I think it's actually quite remarkable how supportive he's been throughout all of this, because I mean, I'm not going to lie, there's some social cost to being supportive of this perspective in that world that he has had to bear as a result of being supportive of my work.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have to say that that the way that he spoke about feeling, compelled to bring his children into his faith, and how that was, one of the, the greatest obligations as a parent that he felt. I think it really kind of shows. I don't know. It made me really kind of empathize with a position that parents are in when they're facing this, when they're facing it from kind of a religious and cultural perspective. I just, the way he spoke about it, it made clear that it was, it was all about love and not, I just think there is a lot more thoughtful than I think people sometimes assume, when they disagree with circumcision. And I appreciated kind of that vulnerability and and as Tim said, the kind of trajectory of his thinking. May I ask about your brother?
Sure. He actually did come around to my way of thinking. Naftali, he lives in Berlin now, and he's a sort of spiritual master. He has these spiritual dance events that he hosts. He's very big in the New Age scene in Berlin, and is a brilliant musician also. I mean, he's brilliant in many ways, but he has totally come around to my way of thinking about circumcision. I think if there's any daylight between us, it's the emphasis that I put on the effects on sexual experience. He's not as persuaded by that side of it as I am, but I would say, emphasizes even more than I do the trauma to the infant and the sort of, what that says about us, and the kind of impact that has on a child.
Yeah, the impact part, the Dr. Phyllis Marks is her name, correct? Yes.
Yep.
So she was the one at the end as well, right? Was she the one? In the home, right? So to me, just in my head, I'm hearing her saying, "Oh, the baby's just upset because you're taking its diaper off," and then seeing what's happening at the end. It's just, the disconnect is really kind of shocking. Is there anyone else that from the film that you had any sort of follow up with in the years after?
Yeah. So first of all, about Dr. Marks, I also thought that was kind of remarkable, and it stands out as a very interesting contrast in the film, like what she says about it when I'm interviewing her versus what's happening in the actual room when it's happening.
Mhm.
And she, and also I think the presence of the camera forced her into this really strange sort of self-talk that you hear, like where she's like kind of talking to the infant in a like, oh, it's not going to be, I'm sorry that we're doing, like, I think it, like the camera kind of snapped her out of the normal routine of it and into like a self-reflection for a little bit there, which was also interesting.
Mhm.
um I had some contact with Donnie Aaron, Rabbi Aaron, who is the head of the Reform Brit Milah program, who was gung ho on the health benefits, and she was upset, and so we went out to lunch, and um, I said to her, like, look, as a filmmaker, I have a very sort of strong code of ethics about how I represent my subjects, and I really just want to make sure that you don't feel like I misrepresented your views in any way, because that would really be something that I would have to think about. And she said, no, I don't think you misrepresented my views at all. And I said, well, then what's the problem? And she basically said to me that I had I had her in the film saying something, and then I cut to something that contradicted what she was saying, and that bothered her. Um, and I said I can understand why that would be upsetting, but that does not break my ethical code as a filmmaker. And I'm sorry that that upset you, but that's kind of what this is. That's fair game.
I'd like to make a comment about Dr. Phyllis Marks. Ellie had showed the film at the Gene Siskel Film Center in downtown Chicago one night and had a Q&A afterwards. And Dr. Marks came to the screening, as did the Weber Schiffrin family, or the parents, not the kids. Um, and one of the things that has always happened in the Q&As that, and I've been to probably at least 10, somebody talks about how Dr. Phyllis Marks says one thing, as you pointed out earlier, Alexis, and then when you see her doing it, it's very, very different. And during the Q&A when that she attended, I was sitting just 7 or 8 seats away from her probably. And suddenly in the middle of the Q&A, she got up and hurriedly left. I hope that she was realizing, maybe for the first time, how what she had said and done in the film was being seen by people. But I have no knowledge that she stopped doing circumcisions. But she would look very, very uncomfortable and then just suddenly got up and left. I would like to thank Ellie for. I'm well aware that he hadn't originally wanted the premiere to be at the Hillel Center at the University of Chicago. He had wanted it at some Jewish film festivals, which all turned him down. But it was so useful for me because I stood outside the University of Chicago Hospital for 10 years. And the University of Chicago has a very high percentage of Jewish students and faculty and staff for compared to most other universities in this country. And so when Jewish people came and talked to me, I could always point to this film and say, well, it premiered here at the University of Chicago Hillel Center. And they brought it back and showed it a second time.
There's a really funny story about that too, Dan. I'm sorry to interrupt, but so the screening at the University of Chicago Hillel, which was really technically the world premiere of this film, we had, as Dan was mentioning, some trouble getting into Jewish film festivals or general festivals. Um, but that screening also almost didn't happen. The I think it was the Jewish Federation that called up the director of the University of Chicago, Hillel, and was putting pressure on him not to have this event. And he assumed that the reason that they wouldn't want to have the event was because of, it's a controversial thing, criticizing or thinking critically about circumcision in a Jewish space is a dicey proposition. But it turns out that there was an errant line in my bio at the time that said that I hadn't served in the Israel Defense Forces for ethical reasons. And it was that line in my bio that led to the Federation trying to get the event canceled. And the director was so sort of taken aback by this. And he was kind of like, you do realize that he's criticizing circumcision and Brit Milah. And they're like, yeah, fine. But like, he said he didn't serve in the IDF for ethical reasons. So that's a funny story.
Oh my goodness. One other thing that I just wanted to ask you about, Ellie, was the last sentence that you say in the film about, basically how, and please correct me if I'm misrepresenting what you say, but basically, that you kind of find it fundamental to your Jewish identity to know when to disobey. I can't remember if that's the exact word you used, but to me that was like so profound, and I just was wondering if you could kind of explain a little bit. Because that was just like a perfect ending, I thought.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean that I'm actually still very proud of that ending. It was, in a way, it's like it was a reaction to Hershey Warsh, who is a character in the film that gets an enormous amount of attention all these years later, because he's charismatic and he speaks so plainly about the ethics of it and what it means, and his famous the famous phrase, it's traumatic, it's abusive, like granting that it's abusive, right? So that's a very sort of big thing. But if you'll notice a little bit later in the film, he says being Jewish means obeying. That's what being Jewish means. And I was realizing when he said that it was exactly the opposite of what being Jewish meant to me, right? So we had other sort of ideas about what being Jewish means to people being presented in the film, and Leonard Glick of blessed memory, talks about how, both of us sitting here in this room right now wouldn't have made our career choices if we weren't Jewish, and that's a kind of secular Jewish identity. But for me, I realized when Warsh said being Jewish means being obedient, I was like, that's so crazy, because I think it's the exact opposite. It's knowing when to be disobedient. And so ultimately, I wanted to end on a note of giving people permission to have a broader sense of what being Jewish means. And for me, it came out in that sort of negative, right? It's knowing when to be disobedient.
Picking up on Rabbi Warsh, Ellie, I have to thank you for something that I just remembered after watching this film the second time. When I made my video in 1995, Whose Body, Whose Rights, I was coming from sort of a left-wing progressive idea that, well, of course, everybody understands the concept of your body belongs to you. And one thing I was totally unaware of is that, at least within Orthodox circles, as Warsh said, his body belongs to God.
Right.
And what most of us in this movement today are thinking is, well, it's a universal human rights principle. Your body is your choice. It's your autonomy. And not realizing that there's probably a whole group of religious people, not just within Judaism, but perhaps also within Islam, who don't believe that God made them, and so therefore their bodies belong to God, and man's laws about human rights don't apply.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a really interesting way, I go back and forth between two ideas that seem to contradict each other, but somehow are both true about circumcision. One is that at the very base of genital cutting practices cross-culturally and globally are the same psychological mechanisms that perpetuate it, the same psychological trauma that's being perpetuated. There's like a lot of similarities. But on the other hand, there are like areas in which things are just so profoundly different, right? So if we're talking about an American parent in, Kansas making a choice to have a hospital circumcision for their child, the motivations behind that are different than, Hershey Warsh deciding that he's going to circumcise his son, or my father deciding that he's going to circumcise me, or, a Muslim in Turkey deciding that they're going to circumcise their son there at age 12. Right. So like, yes, in a way, there are things that kind of connect across cultures based on universal human psychological factors. This widespread, globally practiced rite, procedure, whatever you want to call it. But on the other hand, like, you do have to sort of understand that like differences creep up also. So when we were talking at the beginning about my father talking about the responsibility that he felt, and the kind of cultural responsibility and the religious responsibility, that sort of weight is not something that an American person who's doing it for supposed health reasons is going to be feeling. And it's going to add a different kind of a dynamic. Also, the fact that it's a communal event in Jewish circles and in many Muslim circles, as opposed to something that's being done behind closed hospital doors. So yeah, I mean, it's complex, and in some ways circumcision has commonalities across cultures, but there are other ways in which there are unique facets and features that need to be appreciated, especially if you want to talk about this in a way that's going to be effective, I think.
Yeah, Tim, I'm glad you brought that up again, because it kind of circled back to what I was saying, but you put it a lot more eloquently, just about how, in the mind of a parent who believes that, as you said, Tim, the body belongs to God, and this is just how fundamental it is. It's almost like I'm sure many parents in that situation feel like that they're not only are they, I guess, obligated to do it out of, custom or culture, but that they would be harming their children by not doing it, because that is how important it is in their, understanding of their religious faith. And I think just having that understanding is so important for activists, like you said, Ellie, to understand that while there are commonalities, and we can say, that your body, your choice, or that the child deserves a choice, that you have to understand the perspective of the person you're speaking to. They may not feel that way, and so how can you reach people who don't feel that way? So I thought that was I'm glad you brought that up, Tim.
Well, people come to this from all different levels of intensity of their Jewish practice in their life. How significant is that in terms of the total pie chart of what makes up their personality? Mm-hmm. But it's important to remember, I mean, a Jewish person is probably a lot more likely to have attended a bris in their life and seen this done to somebody. And maybe that explains why, even though there are only in this country less than 2% of the people are Jewish, when I travel to intactivist events, we're there to let everybody know that circumcision should be not done to anybody without their choice. I find, and I've taken literal shows of hands to count this, that 20% of the people who travel at great personal expense to fight circumcision are from a Jewish background. So they're way overrepresented on their movement, and it's possibly because they're the ones who witness it and get a chance to really see how it impacts the suffering baby.
Good point, Ron. Alexis, are you okay with maybe finding some of the questions that have been posed? I see a lot of these 13 Q&As are mostly comments, but there's a couple questions that have been thrown in there that
oh gosh, I'm sorry, I actually don't see any. I don't see the questions. I don't. Can you see them, Tim? I apologize.
Sure, I see them.
Sure, I can kick them out.
I would have answered them much sooner. I apologize.
No, that's
who directed them.
You're very busy doing other technical aspects of this webinar. The very first question, which I think is pertinent to what we've been talking about, it comes from anonymous attendee, and I assume this would be directed at Ellie, but maybe perhaps open to the whole panel. But here's the question. How do you respond when members of the Jewish community call Jews who object to neonatal circumcision, quote, self-hating Jews, end quote?
I mean, I have to be honest, like, I know I've heard from people that some people call me this behind my back sometimes. It's usually actually more around my politics around Israel, Palestine than it is around circumcision. But it's always just like a laugh. Like, no one serious could look at my life and my work and say something like that about me. I'm just so tied into Jewish community, and like, even though I'm not like a traditionally observant religious person, I do have lots of practices. Like, I'm married to an Orthodox woman. I belong to multiple Jewish communities. I'm constantly learning. Like, I'm more Jewish than just about anyone you're ever going to meet. So when people call me a self-hating Jew for like thinking critically about Jewish practices, it just sort of makes me laugh. And it, to be honest, like in my experience, it doesn't really. I know that for some people who don't have the level of obvious Jewish engagement that I do, it's more of like a thing that they have to deal with, and I don't want to make light of that, but it just never sticks with me because like anyone who knows anything about me is just like self-hating. Like, yeah, self-hating Jews constantly are doing Shabbat meals and like going to synagogues and teaching Torah and co-founding Jewish organizations. Like, it doesn't stick to me.
Well, and the fact that somebody wants to apply that label to you, I'm sorry that happens to you, that you have to defend yourself against something, but the label that someone chooses to put on this has nothing to do with the human rights of the baby we're talking about. I mean, if this comes up when the target of the accusation isn't around, my response to this question is, yeah, but that's just a label you want to put on it. That doesn't change anything about the discussion of the baby's human rights. So you can talk right past that accusation if you're dealing with somebody and hoping to enlighten them.
And for what it's worth, it's never had any impact on my ability to talk to people in the Jewish world or for people to take me seriously that I've been able to discern at all, like ever. Right? This is that there are things that get in the way of having these conversations, but this kind of accusation doesn't stick to me because there's just like literally no truth to it. It's also kind of an absurd thing to say, like if you think about it for a second. And I like to joke with people that I'm not a self-hating Jew, I'm a masochistic Jew, and that's an important difference.
Thank,
When I was protesting outside the University of Chicago, I would often be accused of being anti-Semitic. And I finally came up with what I think was the correct answer to them. And I would tell them, what does this have to do with religion? We don't do religious circumcisions here at the hospital. Anyone who cares about religious circumcision should be out here protesting with me if they're Jewish and demanding that the hospital stop circumcising Jewish boys in an invalid manner. That's actually blasphemous. I would say that religious circumcisions are done in a religious ceremony. People say prayers, they give blessings. A ritual is performed according to religious laws and traditions that are all supposed to have deep spiritual meaning. We don't do that here. And I would say that no Christian parent considers their child baptized simply because somebody in the neonatal unit gave the kid a bath and water got splashed on the kid's head. That is not a baptism. And the circumcisions we do here are not a bris. So when people would accuse me of being anti-Semitic, I almost took that as a compliment because they had nothing to say once I explained that this is not about religion. This is about human rights.
Thanks.
I would like to say that during those 10 years, I heard all sorts of incredibly private confessions about people's sexual practices and habits, et cetera, which I would never tell, this person said this or whatever. But during those 10 years, 6 Jewish women married to intact men said that they enjoyed the sex better with the intact man.
Thank you, Dan. We have more questions here, but I'm going to exercise executive privilege here and ask my own question that sort of piggybacks on what we've been talking about the difference between medical circumcision and religious circumcision. And again, Ellie, this is directed at you or for you. I think everybody here, and probably most of our attendees, would agree that Jewish and Muslim boys have just as much right to their bodies and the human right of bodily integrity as anyone else, and that they should be protected. But as a political strategy, however, and I think you might know where I'm going with this, what are your thoughts about an incremental strategy for this movement of first eradicating non-religious medicalized circumcision, and that once that's accomplished, then moving on to support Jews and Muslims, maybe Jewish and Muslim plaintiffs in a legal situation where they challenge their own religions? Because I hear all the time from people who's in the movement who say, oh, well, we can't separate the two. That would not be right. It would be abandoning our Jewish and Muslim friends. But as a political strategy, what do you think about this incrementalist approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I'm known for publicly stating that I don't think there's a principled reason to, separate out religious circumcision from medical circumcision. And I to this day, I believe that. But there is a good tactical argument to be made. And in particular, if you're familiar with the history of the movement over the last few decades, I think it's pretty clear, especially in the United States, but I would argue that this is true elsewhere as well, that if you don't have a religious exemption in your political or legal efforts, you're just going to fail. Like, I mean, and it's not like you should fail. Like, again, I want to be really clear here. I don't think that there, from a human rights perspective, is a difference. But tactically, like, if you're not arriving at this conclusion after seeing what's happened over the last 20 years with various efforts, then you're not paying attention and you're insisting on something for a principle, but you're not being pragmatic. Like, I sincerely believe, and I actually don't know the answer to the question, how successful will efforts with a religious exemption be? I think that's an open question. What I do know is that without a religious exemption, especially in the United States, in terms of the way our constitutional system works legally, you're just not going to win, right? It's going to be defeated on freedom of religion grounds. And then the question is, again, tactical and pragmatic. What do you prefer? Do you prefer to be right, or do you prefer to actually make progress, right? And so to me, that is a very, very compelling and strong argument in favor of political organizing and legal initiatives that have a religious exemption in them, whatever you may feel about the human rights of that.
I think if we're going to use the word incremental, there's a whole lot of increments that come before banning anything. And those include things like eliminating funding, Medicaid funding for the procedure, requiring a better, more complete informed consent. And the one I was thinking of a second ago, making it illegal to traffic in stolen human body parts without setting up some sort of process to keep the donor, if you will, the person from whom they were stolen, in the loop for any profits. Let's require that the baby gets half the money, or 1 penny. Let's just say
as compensation for the future.
Yeah. There are things you can do that have nothing to do with banning it that would have a huge damper on people circumcising, because they'd have to get more information. They'd say, well, why am I signing this? You mean my baby's going to get 1 penny for his foreskin? Who's going to get the rest? And then they would find out that there's a traffic in the stolen tissue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Moving along here, we have another question. And again, this is directed for Ellie. It's from Joshua J. And I'm reading here directly. Do you have any thoughts about Nama Carlin's book, Morality, Violence, and Ritual Circumcision, Writing with Blood, which mentions your film and Rabbi Hershey Warsh? She argues that the violence of circumcision is, quote, not necessarily a causal happening, and in that it is related to existence and to being. It resists definition through binary oppositions. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I've got lots of thoughts about Dr. Carlin's book. And in fact, she was the final episode of the Bruchim podcast, of the first season of the Bruchim podcast. So if you'd like to hear me and my co-host, Max Duboff, and Dr. Naama Carlin going at all of the issues and covering everything that she talks about in her book, I highly recommend that you check out the season finale of season 1 of the Bruchim podcast. In short here, I'll say that Dr. Carlin has written a very interesting book. I think what we discovered through that conversation, and again, I do recommend that you go listen to the whole thing, but I think what we discovered is that her kind of basic approach to these issues is as a social scientist. So she favors structural explanations for things, and she's also very much in the continental philosophy side of things. So she's relying on, Girard and Freud and Derrida, very heavily on Derrida, post-structuralism, critical theory, these sorts of ways of thinking about things. And so in a way, our concerns about this issue are a little orthogonal to each other because we're starting from such different kinds of places of thinking about this that, so for example, the ethical component of it is something that she can see, but is not sort of in any way determinative for her. And she's had a bit of an evolution over time also on this issue. That's a very highfalutin theoretical conversation, and I love having those, but that's what I'll say about that for now. And I again refer you to the season finale of season 1 of the Bruchim podcast.
Great, thanks, Ellie. We have another question here from Tina Kimmel. I was so struck with the sort of extreme mental illness of all the pro-circ individuals in the film. Is there a name, in addition to denial, for the mental condition of people who are so gaslit and subjugated themselves that they then inflict that abuse on others?
Was that for me or for
you? Well, no, I'm sorry. I didn't specify, and neither did Tina. So I guess it's an open question for anybody.
I've been talking a lot, so I'll let someone else answer that first. Okay, I'll talk some more.
There you go, Ellie. By
I'll
default,
talk some more.
There you go.
Look, I think the literal answer to that question is being human. I think this is something that happens to people in many, many different areas, and it's the way lots of injustice and trauma get perpetuated in the world. And I, for one, find it more productive when I'm trying to persuade people about this and talk publicly about this to avoid moralizing or denigrating language about the people perpetuating these things, even though I may, on some emotional level feel it, right? Like I might feel like I'm looking at something traumatic, I'm looking at something abusive, I'm looking at abusers, and then you start slipping into kind of assigning negative moralizing language to the people doing it. I don't find that approach to thinking or talking about this to be particularly productive in terms of my goals with what I want to see, which I think are our shared goals here, which is that we all want to see less of this in the world. And so from my perspective, trying to stay in a mind space where I'm not going to a dark place of moralizing about the people doing it, but I'm sort of clear-eyed about what's happening here. And then when I talk about it, I try and create a space where I can meet someone where they can actually be receptive to what I'm saying.
And what I would add about that is when you encounter somebody who's in denial, you're probably talking to somebody who's way off at the extremes on this topic. You know, if you did a bell curve of how intensely people feel about this, the people way over here in the tail of that curve are not really where we need to spend our time. There are so many fertile minds in the middle, in the hump, that I think you know, when you get to somebody who's that denialistic, you just you say, well, I really believe in the human rights. I'm guided by minimizing suffering in the world. I'm going to go talk to somebody who's receptive to that message, and you move on.
I agree, Ron. We have another question here from Leif Thompson, who, full disclosure, is an MD, a family physician, and he's a member of the board of GALDEF. And I believe, Ellie, he's a member of Bruhim.
He is indeed.
Okay.
Hi, Leif.
So here's his question. There was discussion in the film of the exclusion of Jewish boys and men from Jewish culture if they had not been circumcised. Has there been any investigation of men who were born Jewish, circumcised, and as a result, rather than being estranged, instead they estranged themselves from Jewish life and Jewish identity due to their experience of being injured by circumcision and cultural complicity in that injury?
That's a great question. The answer is, like, the literal answer is no. There hasn't been any study into that. But as Leif knows, and I will share with you right now, at Bruhim, we see people like that all the time. We see either Jewish men who have been alienated from their Jewish identity around this issue, or families who have had deep kinds of conflicts around this. It's a lot of the work that we do at Bruhim is providing a kind of welcoming landing spot for people like that to come back and sort of reclaim their Jewish identity without feeling like they have to compromise on their ethics and morals and their feelings about this. And to some extent, we're also, as Leif very well knows, dealing with people who are in trauma and who need guidance and support for a matter that it's like there are two layers of taboo around it, right? The first layer is the just general American taboo about talking about, you know, genital cutting practices for men and boys. And then you layer on top of that the cultural taboo within the Jewish community, and that's the work we do at Bruhim.
And if we're worried about people's potential to be bullied in the future, do we punish the victim of their bullying to prevent that, or do we focus on eliminating bullying and coaching people about why they shouldn't be bullies? I don't even like to entertain that. I mean, so you plan to hurt this child in the future. That's what you're saying, you know, when you say, I think that kid's going to be bullied. By you mean?
When I was at the University of Chicago, I talked to Jewish students and adult, one professor, who were not circumcised, and they had no problems with, you know, being Jewish and not circumcised. But I also talked to a number of Jewish men who were very, very upset and wanted nothing to do with Judaism. And one in particular, I want to try and tell you about briefly. He had spent his first 2 years very upset with my protest. He had never talked to me. He would walk to the other side of the street if he needed to pass me. He was upset. He didn't think the university should be allowing me to be out there. And he spent his third year in Europe on a study abroad program. And he's gay. And he discovered foreskin in Europe. And he came back for his fourth year, and he had decided he wanted nothing to do with Judaism. He was no longer Jewish. He despised Judaism, couldn't deal with it. He organized his own protest for 1 week in my old spot because I was no longer in Chicago. He tracked me down, got my phone number or whatever, contacted me and asked me if I would come back to help him protest for that week. And so I did.
Wow.
And he had a whole group of friends, Jewish and non-Jewish, to help him do this. But he had decided he wanted nothing to do with Judaism anymore. And I ran into several guys like that, but this was the most vocal and angry and angry one that I talked to.
Tim, I'm not sure how many more questions there are just because I don't see them for some reason. I do have one concluding question that I do want to make sure I get to ask. So how many questions?
We've answered all the questions that there are. All the rest were comments. So go ahead,
Okay.
Alexis.
Sure. I just wanted to ask, as a non-Jewish person, I think in the movement sometimes there is too much tendency to kind of speak at people, sometimes kind of aggressively, in a way that is it does work for many people. It convinces them, and there are many people for whom it just makes them dig their heels in more, and just more strongly hold on to the beliefs that they have about circumcision. And I just think it's important to make sure in communicating with people for whom there is kind of a significant cultural or religious meaning behind the practice. What can non-Jewish people do in having those conversations as activists?
It's a great question. I mean, the first thing is this is the easy way. I'll give you the easy way and the hard way. The easy way is refer them to Bruchim, refer them to me, refer them to our stuff, bruchim.online, or my film, cutthefilm.com. You can rent it straight off the website. People can watch that. That's the easy way, is referring people to people who, like me, are Jews and deeply engaged in the Jewish community and are critical of this practice. The harder way, which I want to encourage everyone who is up for this sort of work to do, is to actually educate yourself about the Jewish side of it. And one of the things that I do at Bruchim is spend a lot of time and energy putting together resources for people, whether they're text studies, traditional Jewish texts that I try to make accessible to everybody. We have an amazing director of education who's also my co-host on the podcast. We have the podcast, resources on our website, but this is the hard way because it takes a lot of work. You have to read a lot, you have to learn a lot, you have to sort of have a deeper appreciation of all the things that we were talking about this afternoon, of what are the differences about someone who's coming at this from a religious perspective or a cultural Jewish perspective, and right? So you have in the Jewish world, this is just an example of the sort of things that you might sensitize yourself to. In the Jewish world, you have the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox. Orthodox Jews, for the most part, are doing this out of a sense of religious obligation. Some of them might have concepts that their bodies and their children's bodies are owned by God, stuff like that. It's not all Orthodox, but lots of them have that sort of kind of model of thinking about this. Non-Orthodox Jews are not doing it out of a sense of religious obligation, but out of cultural devotion and history, right? So know who you're talking to, know what the differences are, know what the different motivations are, know what some of the foundational Jewish texts that talk about it are. If I say Genesis 17, that should instantly spark a thing in your head about a biblical passage that's super important to Jews of all stripes, right? So having this kind of a knowledge base, which takes time to learn about. But again, if you want to have these conversations, and you don't want to just be dismissed as anti-Semitic or as, some people are going to do that no matter what, and there's nothing you can do about that. But for a good faith person, they're listening when you're talking. If you're going to be talking about Jewish circumcision, they're listening for how much do they know and how much is ignorance? How much time has this person spent actually thinking about Jewish circumcision? Or is it just sort of like an afterthought? Right? These are all things that will come through in the way you talk about it if you put in the work. And I know it's harder than referring to people who, are like me or Leaf or, Bruchim, but I want to encourage people to do that because there's, Jews don't have a monopoly over Jewish knowledge, Jewish history, and Jewish texts. Anyone can pick up a book and read. So, and the more that the person you're talking to can sense that you've taken the time to do that in a respectful way, the more receptive they'll be to what you have to say.
Thank you. And I think it's also helpful. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Dan, was that you?
I was going to say that in my 10 years talking to people probably 99% of my conversations were one-on-one. And I think I eventually got very good at letting them tell me what they were interested in with these issues. I stood there with a sign, for example, saying foreskin is not a birth defect, and human, genital integrity is a human right, etc. Then I would let them start the conversation so that I knew where they were coming from. Now, I was not very good at this the first couple of years, maybe, but I got a lot better. But it's important to let them express where their concerns are, whether it's religious or non-religious or whatever. Because if I just start in on them, then I'm attacking them, it seems. Let them come to me.
I agree, Dan. And as a commentary on an experience we just had this past weekend with GALDEF's booth at Palm Springs Pride, inevitably the question of Jewish circumcision comes up. And we always have materials on our at our booth about celebrating Brit Shalom, the book, and Rahim, and I can talk in somewhat of a more intelligent way about Jewish circumcision than most people expect, and I'm certain that's been the experience of Ron and Dan as well, that people are impressed that we've taken the time to learn about these aspects of Judaism, and I think that it is incumbent upon anyone who wants to be involved in this movement to do more research, to understand more about the religious aspects of circumcision, both Jewish and Muslim. And one comment I made this past weekend really caught this Jewish person who came to our booth off guard. I don't know whether, Ellie, you would approve of this, but they made the comment something to the effect that others in the Jewish community have made of, yes, but I have the centuries of ancestors looking over my shoulder about this. And my response was, but over the other shoulder, don't you have centuries of your descendants also looking over that shoulder to see what kind of decision you'll make? And they were kind of left speechless by that. And I don't know if that was a good technique to use, but it definitely caused the person to sort of nod and go, and said, thank you very much as they walked away. So it kind of disarmed them.
I stay kosher.
Well, thank you for your answer on that, for all of your contributions to that question, because I think that is very important. And even just understanding, is this, if someone is Orthodox or not, that the kind of belief behind that and tied to why they may or may not be circumcising, or their belief about circumcision, is going to be different right there. And in the approach and how you talk to people, with compassion and just understanding kind of what is, central to their belief about it. Coming into it with that knowledge, I think it does show kind of respect for the discourse and for the person, and I think that is how you can potentially, change minds. So,
and if somebody's going to be out there doing activism and they're worried about getting caught off guard by questions about Jews, maybe you live someplace where you're less likely to encounter Jewish people. I think you need to go out of your way to enjoy the company of more Jewish people. I listen to a podcast called Ask a Jew, just so I have gotten to know these two hosts. One's Orthodox and one's not, and one's in Israel and one's in LA, but they've gotten together to do this podcast. And I just feel like getting to know them, they're, I know them better than, I hear them talk more than I hear my own family talk, even though my sisters just live 20 minutes away. It keeps me in the right frame of mind. Every person that you're trying to persuade, if you treat them as respectfully as you would treat a loved one, they're more likely to hear your message.
I want to just add one thing about the time that we're living in right now, which is very challenging for Jews. And this is something that I think anyone who wants to talk about this issue needs to be very, very strongly aware of if they're going to be talking to Jews about this. We're living, unfortunately, in a time of rising anti-Semitism. Also, the attacks of October 7th last year have put everyone on edge in a very, very painful way. So be aware that like Jews are on edge more than they usually are. Definitely over the last 10 years, it's gotten like anti-Semitic attacks against Jews. I mean, in my neighborhood here in Los Angeles, I live in a Jewish neighborhood, and we have things that are being said to us that weren't being said to us 5 years ago in public. So anyone who's Jewish is going to be feeling that, and just be mindful that people are really sensitive right now to anything that could potentially be seen as anti-Semitic.
And along those lines, Ellie, if anybody wants to know more, there is the published statement about confronting anti-Semitism within the genital autonomy movement. And one of the FAQs, which you did such a brilliant job of, is outlining what it is considered anti-Semitic and what is not considered anti-Semitic. And do you happen to remember what the URL is for that, or
It's on the Beyond the Bris blog, which is Rebecca Wald's blog. And I mean, if you just Google "standing against anti-Semitism," I think it'll pop up in a Google search. Or you could just go to Beyond the Bris and search for the statement against anti-Semitism within the genital autonomy movement. One of the things that we worked, and it was a team effort, and Tim was part of that team, but one of the things that we worked really hard on was to try, and we wanted it to not just be a kind of throwaway political statement, but we wanted it to be useful to people who, like, in good faith, just want to know, like, where are the lines? Like, because it can sometimes be not simple to determine, because anti-Semitism has been around for so long. It has such a long history, and there's so many different kinds of tropes that if you don't know, if you're not familiar with this history, you might not be aware of, that you might accidentally stumble into. So people who want to like understand where some of those lines are, we did in that statement put examples, and then their mirror, like examples of things when you're talking about circumcision that could be considered anti-Semitic, and examples of like versions of it that wouldn't be anti-Semitic, for people who, are being mindful of this.
And that, by the way, for people who aren't aware, is beyondthebris.com. It's not a .org, it's a .com address.
And I hope actually to do that I'm very proud of the sort of collective work that statement represents. A lot of us put a lot into that, and I think it stands up really well. But it's obviously not enough, and I'm aware of that. And I'm hoping at some point to put together resources that go more in depth into some of these issues, so that people can really learn a little bit more about, where do these anti-Semitic ideas come from, and like, talking about just sort of in more detail, like where are some of these lines, and how can we sort of collectively work together as a movement to be careful about how we talk, so that we don't perpetuate anti-Semitism, especially in an era where it's kind of on the rise.
Great, thanks, Ellie. So there are no further questions in the Q&A feature. Alexis, do you want to sort of wrap this up? And
Sure. Again, thank you everybody for attending, and for sharing information about those resources that you mentioned on the Beyond the Bris website. I know I am going to check those out. So just a reminder that we are going to be holding another film screening probably in March 2025. So please, if you are not subscribed to GALDEF's newsletter, please visit the site and subscribe, so we can make sure you hear about that. But I really I want to thank all of you for being here. Ellie, Dan, Ron, and Tim, of course. Thank you just so much. And thank you to all the attendees. And if you have any, follow-up questions, please let me know. We will be sharing this recording, I believe, on the blog item about it, of the discussion portion. So thanks everybody for attending, and have a great rest of your day or evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.